Today's daf is daf Nun Zayin, but we'll begin on Nun Vav Hamid Beis. We're going to try to make up somehow Nun Vav, but the Mishnah Habachar Hamaser HaPesach Kodshim Kalim. So the Mishnah combines Bechar, Maser, and Pesach for the following halachas. They're all Kodshim Kalim, Shchitos B'chol Mokum Bazora. There's no requirement of tzafon as there is in Kodshe Kodshim. And they're very unique in that domon ton matana achas, because with regard to all other karbonos, for example, the hazoyos of the chatos primios, there you require manifold hazoyos, large numbers, and even with regard to chatos chitzonios, you require shtaim shenachas, and even with regard to shlomim. But we're going to have derivations that in these cases of Bechor, Maser, and Pesach, uniquely, all you need is one matana. And that matana has to be applied to the Mizbeach Bilvad Shiten Keneged HaYisod. It's got to be on the Mizbeach Keneged HaYisod, to the exclusion of the eastern and southern corners where there was no Yisod, Shina Bachilosam. And yet, even though the Mishnah combines Bechor, V'Maser, V'Pesach as if it were all one group, however, there is a fundamental difference. HaBechor Nechal LeKohanim. And the Bechor is eaten by the Kohanim and not for non-Kohanim, except we'll see about the Bechor that we once touched upon, that he could give it to his Avodim, Eved Kanani, to his wife. However, HaMaser L'chol Adam. Maser doesn't require a Kohen for Achila, and for sure Pesach is L'chol Adam. However, Nechol B'chol Ha'ir, with regard to Bechor, Maser, and Pesach, well, Pesach is a little different because you're not allowed to take the meat outside the Chabura, but let's focus on Bechor and Maser. Here they're equal, that they could be eaten anywhere in Yerushalayim. Again, if you're talking about the Bechor, then it's the Kohen who's eating the basar of the carbon anywhere in Yerushalayim. If you're talking about Maser, anyone could eat it within Yerushalayim. L'shnei Yomim v'layla echad. And this is going to be a major part of today's daf, that the amount of time for Achilas Kodshim Kalim is 2 days. However, the exception to that rule is going to be Pesach, Ein Echel B'Layla, because the Torah says V'yochlas Habasar B'Layla Hahu Hadlayla Zeh, means that Pesach is only eaten at night. Not only that, Eino Nechal Ela Ad Chatzos, we'll see later on in Mitzvah Shem today on Daf Nun Zayin and Beis, that we have a derivation that the Pesach has to be eaten by Chatzos, and the impression you get from the Mishnah is that that's a doraisa halacha. Normally, when we say that something could be done throughout the night, but you have to do it by chatzot, that's only archaka d'rabbanan. And here we're dealing with a doraisa. Ve'eino nechal el limnuya, ve'eino nechal el tzli. So the Korban Pesach has unique halachas v'achila. Number one, in terms of the time restriction up to chatzos, and it's not yom v'layla. Number two, it has to be eaten sli, it has to be roasted, and also it's only eaten to those who, michsas nefashos, who buy a chelek in the carbon, in the lamb. They have to purchase a part. That's called minuyov. Tosfos asks, why doesn't it mention also that the basar of Pesach has to be eaten with matzah umorer? The Torah says, al matzah umorer yochlu, and that should have been another additional unique halacha in the constellation of Kodshim, that Korban Pesach requires matzu morer. And Tosfos gives a number of examples. Number one, that matzu morer is not really part of the hakrava, and this is not something that you can contrast with other karbonos. Also, Tosfos says that it's not likuva, and even if you had ate the basar Pesach without matzu morer, you would be mekayim the mitzvah. The Gemara says, Man Tana, who is the author of our Mishnah that holds that the Maser and Pesach requires zrika al gabi mizbeach, just as the Bechor. Rav Chizda Rabbi Yossi HaGlili. Tisanya Rabbi Yossi HaGlili Omer, Chelbo lo nemar el chelbam. The Torah says chelbam in the plural. And not only that, Domo lo nemar el damam. Again, with regard to the dam and the avodas dam, it says damam in the plural. Limed al Bechor u'maser u'pesach shetu'una matan damim ve'murim legabi mizbeach. So we have a source now, according to Rabbi Yossi HaGlili, that the Matan Damim, with regard to all these three categories of karbanos listed in the Mishnah as Bechor, Maser, and Pesach, you require that the dam be placed upon the Mizbeach, and those parts of the Emurim that require Aktorah will be placed on the Mizbeach, and this is derived from the plural of Chelbam and Damam. Keneged HaYisod Minolan, how do we know that the dam has to be thrown, has to be applied at that corresponding that point where there is a Yisod on the Mizbeach? Omer Rav Lazar, Asyan Zrika Me'ola. We derive a Gzeira Shava based on Zrika Me'ola. Now, what we're going to have to figure out is how do we know that Ola itself requires Zrika? And that's where we start our daf today on daf Nun Zayin. V'ola guf minon. How do we know in Ola that you need keneged hayisod, that the zrika has to be in a place on the mizbeach to avoid the mizrach darom, which is not keneged yisod. Tichsiv, it says in the pasuk yisod mizbacha Ola. And what do we interpret? Again, this is a little bit problematic, as Rashi points out, because we use this pasuk for something else, namely Shficha Shirayim. We're not talking about Shficha Shirayim now. We're talking about the application of the dam and the Zrik al Gabi Mizbeach and the Ikra Avoda. But in any event, the Gemara had many different limudim that we derive from the three psukim that repeat themselves. But Limed al Ola Shetu'una Yisod. So it means that the applications, the Matan Domim of an Ola require Yisod. Keneged Yisod. Okay, now the question is the following. Once you have this Gzeira Shava that links Bechor, Maser, and Pesach with Ola, why don't we go a step further? You're learning that the matana, the single matana Bechor, Maser, and Pesach has to be Keneged Yisod from Ola. Why not derive from Ola the nature of the matanos? And the matanos would have to be Shtayim Shein Arba. Abai says, Lamali l'michtav saviv biola saviv bechatos. Why did the Torah repeat itself with regard to saviv? Saviv means that the zrik has to be on all four corners around the mizbeach, and yet the Torah could have written it in ola. We would have derived it in chatos from ola. Why did the Torah have to spell it out in both chatos and in ola? Why did the Torah repeat something when you have one din that's derived twice from two psukim regarding that same thing, that same din? What's the purpose of repeating it? According to this opinion, the Torah is repeating it to tell you that don't derive it and equate it with other dinim. You only limit it to those two cases. Gemara says, there's one Madhyam who says that even when the Torah repeats itself, it becomes a binyan av, and we can equate by analogy all other cases. And the Gemara says, because the Torah repeats itself a third time with regard to the Karban Asham, and tells us in Vayikra Zayin that Saviv is a requirement even in Karban Asham. So we now have Ola, Chatos, and Asham. That's three psukim. Everybody agrees that if the Torah repeats itself thrice, then you don't derive any other conclusions. The Mishnah says, Habachar nechal l'kohanim, whereas Maser could be eaten by anyone, lav dafka kohen, but Bechor has to be eaten by kohen. So what's the source for this halacha? Torah Rabbanon, minayin lebechor shenechal l'shnei yomim v'layla. How do we know that a Bechor like Kodshim Kalim, like Shlomim, for example, would be eaten for 2 days. Shenemar, because the pasuk says, and this pasuk is in the parsha of Korach in Bamidbar Yud Ches, and the pasuk says, "Ubesaram yelchak chazeshof, ubesaram yelach kachazeh hatnufa u kishok hayomin." And then it says, L'chayeh, we'll get back to the last two words in the pasuk soon, but we see now a hekesh in which the Torah equates Bechor with the requirement of Chazal Shok in Shlomim. Hikisha HaKosav L'Chaza V'Shok Shel Shlomim. So we now have a comparison between Bechor and Shlomim with regard to Chaz V'Shok. Ma Shlomim nechal l'shnei yom v'layla echad, af Bechor nechal l'shnei yom v'layla echad. So just like Shlomim, you give them 2 days of achila, so too, with regard to Bechor, we get 2 days of achila. Now the Brisa is going to describe something that took place in Kerem B'Yavna. And Kerem B'Yavna was a place where the Beis Medrash was so full that the Talmidim would sit row after row after row. It looked like a vineyard. And this Brisa is now going to transmit a shaklavataria between the Chachamim. It's going to be Rabbi Tarfon, it's going to be Rabbi Yosef Glili and Rabbi Akiva with regard to the derivation of Bechor from Chaz V'Shok in Shlomim. Zu she'ela nishala l'fnei hachacham b'kerem b'Yavna, Bechor l'kama nechal. How long does the Torah allow you to eat the basar of the Bechor? Is it 1 day or is it 2 days? Nena Rabbi Tarfon v'yomer. Rabbi Tarfon apparently was the gadol there at that time in the Beis Medrash in Kerem B'Yavna. Shnei yom v'layla echad. Now, Rabbi Shmuel doesn't reveal to us how he knows that Bechor could be eaten for Shnei Yom V'layla Echad. Does he have the Hekesh to Chaz V'Shok? This is the first time he showed up in the Beis Medrash in Kerem B'Yavna for Rabbi Yossi Aglili Shmo. So at this point, I guess he's an unknown. It's the first time he shows up, his debut. Amalo, he turns to Rabbi Tarfon, he says, Rabbi Minayin Lecha, how do you know that the meat of a Bechor is eaten for 2 days? Amalo, B'ni, Shlomim Kodshim Kalim, Ubechor Kodshim Kalim. Right, this is what you call a Bamemotzinu, that since both Shlomim and Bechor are both to be subsumed under the general category of Kodshim Kalim, Ma Shlomim Nechol M'shnei Yom V'Leichad Af Bechor Nechol Shnei Yom. So the allotment of time for eating the basar in the case of Bechor should be derived from Shlomim through this Bameh Hatzad, or call it a Bameh Motzinu. And both Shlomim and Bechor belong to the category of Kodshim Kalim, and Kodshim Kalim we saw from Shlomim are eaten for 2 days. Omalo, but Rabbi Yosef Glili was not happy with this. Rebbe, Bechor Matonu L'Kohen. If you want to compare Bechor, you should not compare Bechor to Shlomim, because Bechor is unique, as we said in the Mishnah, that Bechor is eaten only by Kohanim. So the owner of, let's say, the animal that's Petarechem and is a Bechor, he has to give the carbon over to the Kohen. The Kohen is going to do the avodah and then eat the basar of the Bechor. And in that sense, Chatas V'Yoshem Matana. There's a striking similarity between Bechor and Chatas V'Yoshem. Chatas V'Yoshem is also a Matana L'Kohanim. Only the Kohanim are allowed to eat from the basar of Oshem and Chatas. And therefore, Ma Chatas V'Yoshem L'Yom Echad, Af Bechor L'Yom Echad. If we're going to accept a comparison, which seems to be very appropriate between Bechor and Chatas V'Yoshem, then we're limited in the time of Achil to 1 day. Why do you, Rabbi Shmuel, choose to equate Bechor with Shlomim and derive the conclusion that Bechor, like Shlomim, could be eaten for 2 days? Amalo, Rabbi Tarfon responds, Nidon Dover, Nidon Milma Dover, Midov. if you can compare it to two possible comparisons, then let's see where is the more profound and justifiable comparison. Chatos v'yosham is only brought on the occasion of chet. Shlomim has nothing to do with chet. And shlomim is ba b'nedava, chatos v'yosham is not ba b'nedava. B'char, likewise, although it's a korban chova, but it's not a result of chet. And therefore, ma shlomim nechol m'shnei yom v'alechad, af b'char nechol makes sense because we have a striking similarity between b'char and shlomim as opposed to chatos v'yosham. Now, although you're correct, Rabbi Yossi, that chatos v'yosham like b'char is a matana l'kohen, but nevertheless, fundamentally, when we look at it, it's b'char is more comparable to shlomim than it is to chatos v'yosham. Chatos v'yosham is ba'al hachet. Shlomim is not ba'al hachet. B'char is not ba'al hachet. Omalo, Rabbi Yossi is still fighting away. Rebbe, I agree to you that let's look and see which is more similar. Is there a greater similarity between Bechar and Shlomim, or a greater similarity between Bechar and Chatas v'Yosham? Chatas v'Yosham matana l'kohen and Bechar matana l'kohen. That we've already said. But let's go beyond that. Ma Chatas v'Yosham einam bo'im b'neder d'dava is Bechar and b'neder d'dava. Now I have two similarities between Bechar and Chatzos V'Yosham as opposed to Shlomim. Number one, Shlomim is not a matan l'kohen. Number two, Shlomim is ba b'neder u'nedav. Now let's go to the other side. Bechar Chatzos V'Yosham. Number one, it's a matan l'kohen, and furthermore, it's eno ba b'neder u'nedav. There's only a korban chova. You can't voluntarily accept upon yourself Bechar or Chatos or Rosh. Is therefore my Chatos nechol yom echad, Bechar nechol yom echad. So we should come to the conclusion, based on the striking similarity between Bechar and Chatos v'Yosham, that the maximum amount of time that you're allotted for the Bechar is only 1 day. So now the ball is in Rabbi Tarfon's court. He's got to have some sort of pressing Yalfusa to prove that Bechar could be eaten for 2 days, like Shlomim. But at this point, Rabbi Tarfon is sort of stumped. And therefore, Kofetz Rabbi Akiva and Istalik Rabbi Tarfon. Tarfon sort of like takes a back seat, and Rabbi Akiva moves forward to answer this question, very strong objection of Rabbi Yosef Glili, Omer Lo. So Rabbi Akiva turns to Rabbi Yosef Glili and he says, Hareu Omer ubesaram yeh lecha. Right, at the end of the pasuk, there were a couple of words that seemed to be superfluous. And this pasuk is going to compare, as we saw before, to chazav v'shok. Hikishan hakazav l'chav v'shok shel shlomim. So now we have an equation between Bechar and Besarim Yilecha, which is a reference to Chaz v'shok of Shlomim. Ma Shlomim nechol l'shnei yom yalechad, af Bechar nechol l'shnei yom yalechad. Omalo. Rabbi Yossi is still objecting to Rabbi Akiva. He kashta l'chaz v'shok shel Shlomim. Why do you choose? Okay, fine. The Torah mentions here in the Parashat Bechar Chaz v'shok, but Chaz v'shok within the constellation of Shlomim is applicable also to a korban toda. Anima kisho lechaz v'shok shel toda. Now, within the constellation of Shlomim, korban toda is unique. Number one, because it's accompanied with lachmei toda, 40 lechamim, but even more than that, the Torah limits the zman achila in toda to 1 day. And since the Torah in toda, the korban toda requires chaz v'shok like Shlomim, whereas Shlomim can be eaten for 2 days, toda can only be eaten for 1 day, is why not equate Bechar to the chaz v'shok of toda? Why do you choose to equate the Bechar to chaz v'shok of Shlomim? Therefore, toda nechel siyom v'layla, af Bechar nechel yom v'layla malo. Rabbi Akiva comes back and he says, Hareu Omer u'besaram yeh lecha. And Rabbi Akiva is now going to put all his emphasis on the three words Besaram Yeh Lecha. And She'ein Tamid Lomar Lecha Yeh, it's superfluous for the Torah to say Lecha Yeh, because we already know that the Bechar belongs to the Kohanim. Ma Tamid Lomar Lecha Yeh. What do we do with the superfluous words Lecha Yeh? Hosiv HaKosiv Havaya Cheres BeBechar. The Torah wanted to tell you that Yeh is Miloshen Havaya. Havaya means a state of being. And we're going to now equate Bechar with that state of being like a Shlomim and not like a Toda. So here the Mefarshim, Rashi, the Rashash, and others point out that the Gemara here doesn't really go into too much detail about what is Hosav Lecha HaKosav Havaya Cheres BeBechar, and apparently it's a sugya elsewhere in Masechet Bechoros. But one point we have to make over here before we go on, and that is the following. We have Chazav Shok of Shlomim. We have Chazav Shok of Toda. Rabbi Yossi Aglili is arguing that we should choose the Chazav Shok of Toda rather than the Chazav Shok of Shlomim. But why? I mean, earlier, if you recall, in this Brisa, Rabbi Yossi Aglili worked overtime to show you why Bechar should be more comparable to Chatos V'Yosham. Here he doesn't tell you why it should be more comparable to Toda. So Rashi gives an answer here called Tafasta Meruba Lo Tafasta. If you have two possibilities, a greater or a lesser, you take the lesser one. And here too, if we equate Bechar to Shlomim, we come to the conclusion that you get 2 days to eat the Bechar. If, on the other hand, you equate Bechar with Toda, then what you're left with is only 1 day. So you now have a 50-50 choice. You can go this way, you go that way, to right and to left. So what do? Tafasta Meruba Lo Tafasta, you take the limited. And that means the equation to Toda, which is only 1 day. So again, Rabbi Akiva fills in for Rabbi Shmuel, and he has this whole drasha called L'cha Yeh, Hotzev L'kakos V'avoy Acheres, B'Vechor. K'shenemru Dvarim Lifnei Rabbi Shmuel, because again, Rabbi Shmuel wasn't, he had already moved away. Now they tell him what Rabbi Akiva said in order to respond to Rabbi Yosef Omer Lahem. So Rabbi Shmuel responds, Tsu v'imrul Rabbi Akiva ta'isa. Go out, tell Rabbi Akiva he made a mistake. Why? So now we get back into the whole sugya of what methodologies of derivations and exegesis apply to Kodshin. Toda meichan lamda. How do you know the halacha of Chaz v'Shok in Toda? Nowhere in the parsha of Toda is there any mention of Chaz v'Shok. The answer is Mishlomim. So you're going to have to derive it from an equation to Shlomim. And in that sense, Toda is equated to Shlomim. Now, once you have that equation to Shlomim, now you're going to tell me, well, why don't we derive that just like Shlomim can be eaten for 2 days? But again, you're only going through Toda, and Toda itself is derivative of Shlomim. You know what, Rabbi Akiva, go back to your original Lashon, your original presentation, of the basic comparison between the Chaz v'Shok of Toda and Bechar, but don't give me this whole business in which we go back to an equation from Shlomim to Toda and from Toda to Bechar, because we have a principle that Dover Lom V'Hekesh Eino Chozer U'Malav V'Hekesh. Again, now according to Rabbi Shmuel, we have a superfluous pasuk of L'cha Yeh, because that's the pasuk which Rabbi Akiva implemented to derive the conclusion that Bechar is eaten for 2 days. According to Rabbi Shmuel, why do you need that? Hi l'chayim my ovidle limit al b'char b'almum shehu matan l'kohen. Shalomatzin b'chal Torah. With regard to any other korban in the entire constellation of kodshim of korbanos, if the korban is a balmum, then there's no akrova, and certainly you don't give anything to the kohen. The unique halach in bechar is that if the bechar turns out to be a balmum, we give the bechar hook, line, and sinker, the entire bechar, over to the kohen. And we need a derivation for that unique halacha, and that's l'chayiyah havaya, hosif havaya cheres. Rabbi Akiva. So now the ball is in Rabbi Akiva's court. How does he know that even if the bechar turns out to be a balmum, we give it to the kohen? Yolefle mibsaram. What did Rabbi Akiva see in the word mibsaram? Chad tam v'chad balmum. The word b'saram is in the plural. Their basar, T-H-E-I-R. And the plural is come to teach you both in the case of a tam, where the animal has no blemish, or in the bechar, which is a balmum. In all cases, we give the basar to the kohen. Frek Rabbi Shmuel, what is he going to do with b'chayiyah? Because he could derive it from b'saram. B'saram dahanech b'charos kama. The Torah mentions 3 different species of bechar, 3 different types of animals, and the Torah speaks about the ox, the sheep, the goat, and therefore the Torah now uses the word b'saram in the plural to refer to all these 3 species of bechar. But my komifliki, the Gemara wants to know now, what is the difference in the approach to biblical exegesis of Rabbi Shmuel on the one hand and Rabbi Akiva on the other? Mar sovar heimenu v'dover acher havi hekesh, umar sovar lo havi hekesh. So now we're talking about something which is heimenu v'dover acher, which means that we partially learn it from a hekesh, but not totally from a hekesh. And the question is, if you have a partial hekesh, is it considered a hekesh? And therefore we cannot be chozim alamed, you can't build another hekesh on top of the first hekesh, or it's not considered a hekesh at all. It's almost as if it's begufe, it's written in its own parsha. So now, let's see how this applies. We're talking now about chazav v'shok in the case of a korban toda, which is a gift, a matana that's given to the kohanim, and that's derived from a hekesh between toda and shlomim, just like chazav v'shok of shlom is given to the kohen, so too chazav v'shok of toda is given to the shlom. However, that's true as far as the ikar matan is concerned. The fact that chazav v'shok is designated in the case of korban toda to the kohen, that's derived from shlom. That's a full-fledged hekesh. However, now you want to know whether toda could be eaten for 1 day or for 2 days. So now we're going to derive the time limit of bechar from the time limit of toda. And just like toda is only for 1 day, so too bechar is only for 1 day. So basically, we're deriving from a hekesh a din that itself is only partially learned from a hekesh, because it's only the fact that there is a gift of a chazav v'shok to the kohanim that's derived from a hekesh. But in terms of how long you eat the korban bechar, and we're going to equate bechar with toda, that's already not part of the hekesh. So Bishleim, the Gemara says, "Lamadi amalo avi hekesh." I understand. Hainu d'chsiv v'chein yaseli ol moed kishem shemazel lifnai. Okay, this is chatos pnimios, and how many hazoyos do you need lamala? How many hazoyos do you need lamata? Kishem shemazel lifnai v'lifnim. So we start with the hazoyos in the Kodesh Kodashim, and there it's achas lamala v'sheva lamata, and that is midam hapor. Right, there are 2 korbanos on Yom Kippurim that go lifnai v'lifnim, and that's a par and a sa'ir. So in the case of a par, we need in the Kodesh Kadoshim 1 hazoya lemala and 7 hazoyas downwards lemata. Kach maza behecha. Now, after the hazoyos in the Kodesh Kadoshim are completed, the Kohen now takes the rest of the dam of the par, and he does a hazoya, right, 7 and 1, keneged the parochas. That's in the heichal. And just like lifnai v'lifnim, it's always going to be achas lamal and sheva lamata. So too, with regard to the hazoyos outside the Kodesh Kadoshim in the heichal, keneged the parochas, we're going to need sheva lamala, achas lamala, sheva lamata. And we're going to apply the same logic to sa'ir. Shem shlifnai v'lifnim achas lamala v'sheva lamata b'dam sa'ir is kach maza beheichal sheva lamata achas lamala v'sheva lamata. Now, what is explicit in the Torah? The truth is that the number of hazoyos in the Kodesh Kadoshim with regard to the par is not written explicitly in the Torah. The number of hazoyos lamata in the case of the soyer is also right. So again, which is explicit and which is not explicit? Let's just go over this one more time to get it down. The total number of 7 plus 1 is not explicit neither in the case of the par nor in the case of the soyer. But we're going to put them together, par and soyer, derive one from the other through a hekesh. In the case of the par, the Torah only talks about the one single hazoya, which is lamala. Nothing about the 7 lamata. In the case of the soyer, it's just the opposite. So we're going to derive both through a hekesh. And yet, we're going to use another hekesh to derive that which you do hazoya lifnai v'lifnim, also you do in the heichal. So you see that whenever there's a partial hekesh, we can build on, right? So bishlema, let's go back to the bishlema. L'man di'omer lo avi hekesh. Since it's only derived partially, right? In other words, one of the hazoyas we know from, whether it's the par or the soyer, we know explicitly. So we're only using the hekesh partially to jack up the number for the achas lamala sheva lamata. And now we have a full-fledged hekesh equating lifnai v'lifnim with outside the heichal. But laman di'omer have a hekesh ma'ikol meimar. If you're going to say that even if I derive a halacha partially from a hekesh, that's still considered as a chal shem hekesh, then we have the rule of kodshim that we don't build another hekesh on a hekesh. So how do we know the second hekesh? That all the hazoyas that you do with lifnai v'lifnim have to be done and implemented even in the heichal. And the Gemara answers, Makomos hu de gamri adah. This is the first answer of the Gemara, that the second hekesh is not similar to the first hekesh. The first hekesh has to do with the hazoyos of whether it be the par or the soyer, and the second hekesh is makomos, meaning where do you implement those hazoyos, here or there? So therefore, that's not considered a hekesh derived from a hekesh. And now we turn to Omid Beis.